I'm Andrew Petiprin, Fellow of Popular Culture at the Word on Fire Institute. Welcome to you all as we explore Catholic social teaching in this 3-day summit. Today, it is my delight to welcome Father David Orique, who is Associate Professor of Colonial and Modern Latin America, as well as of Iberian Atlantic World History, and the Director of Latin American and Latinx Studies at Providence College. Father Orique is a specialist in Bartolomé de las Casas, who is the subject of Bishop Barron's latest Pivotal Players film, which is to be released shortly. So Father David and I will be getting into the life of Bartolomé de las Casas today, along with his legacy and the implications of his life upon today's church. A little more about Father David before I throw it to him. He is a member of the Dominican order, which he entered in 1993, and was ordained to the priesthood in 2001. He has a master's degree and PhD in history from the University of Oregon, and also has a master's in Spanish literature from the University of Barcelona. He has written many articles and is the author of the book To Heaven or to Hell, Bartolomé de las Casas' Confessionario, which was published in 2018. And I understand he also has another book coming out about Bartolomé de las Casas, which will be released in 2021 by Routledge. Maybe Father can tell us a little bit more about that project. Welcome to you, Father. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much for your invitation.
I'm so delighted you're able to make the time to talk to us about this important figure in the life of the church. And I'd love for you to tell us maybe a little bit more about yourself and how you came to study Bartolomé de las Casas.
Well, my interest in Hispanic or Latin culture or Latino culture has been part of my life. My father is Portuguese. I grew up in Central California, which is a very Hispanic area, primarily from Mexico and Central America. And so I've been around the Spanish language and Portuguese language almost all of my life, effectively. But when for many years, I sensed a call to some kind of vocation. And it wasn't until I was 32 that I met the Dominicans in San Francisco, and I was working in the Bay Area. I worked in commercial banking. And after entering the order, the first year is the novitiate year. It's this initiation year, if you will. We had to choose a Dominican to take a look at. And I had recently been in Spain, in Seville, Spain, as well as I had spent some time in Guatemala. And Las Casas is a prominent figure in both of those places, as well as other parts of Latin America and other Spanish-speaking world. So I chose Las Casas, and it's been an adventure for the last 27 years. I've looked at his life, labor, and legacy. So it's absolutely he's a fascinating figure, I think poorly understood. And so as I realized as I got further into studying his life, how much both misunderstood and poorly understood. So poorly misunderstood in the sense that people sort of pigeonhole him in a certain kind of way, or not understood at all because they're just not even aware that there was a figure like this that is really deeply connected with the American hemispheric history and culture, language, theology, philosophy, and for today's purposes, if you will, Catholic social teaching. Even at that time, we wouldn't use that term, but we clearly see the roots and the legacy of what we're thinking of today in the ways of Catholic social teaching.
Well, let's situate Las Casas in his time then, so we can see how we use him, as it were, to get to where we are today. He was born in 1484. He was born right into this major transition period in the life of the world, the life of the church. And he came to the New World, I believe, in 1502 as a very young man, just 10 years after Christopher Columbus had sailed across the sea. So maybe you could situate him a little bit in terms of the times and what was going on then that he was involved in.
Well, I think, and I'm going to use today, I'll use the term America to refer to the hemisphere, not particularly the United States, but for lots of reasons. If people are curious about it, I'm happy to discuss that with as well. But put Las Casas in his own time, I think the one thing we have to realize is that the impact of this Columbian moment, which some people will use that term, Columbus was a friend of the Pedro Las Casas, or Bartholomew's father was connected. He went on the second trip to the New World, a New World for Europeans, of course, and so he's was almost from the get-go, as you mentioned. You did the chronology. He's connected to this unfolding of what would later become understood as a broader two continents, a whole hemisphere of the Americas. But they're starting out in the Caribbean, and so which is deeply connected to United States history in lots of ways. And the first evangelization point, at least for in the Catholic world, Catholic Christianity is coming to the Americas, starting in the Caribbean and then spreading to the mainland. Well, also along with not only evangelization but also conquest and colonization. So you have these three things mixing together, and so you have figures like Las Casas, and he's not alone. You have other figures as well that are very prominent figures and advocates for the indigenous peoples. And you'll later on you'll have people who've been very strong advocates on the behalf of Africans who are being enslaved, denouncing the African slave trade. And interestingly, in the 16th century, this is little known, and I have an article online. It is in English, about Las Casas and another 16th century Dominican who was a Portuguese Dominican, who were the first that we know of to denounce the African slave trade and to denounce unjust war. I mean, I think one of the challenges that we have in English speaking or English texts that we read, they're very heavily influenced by British historiography. And for many, many, many years, and I don't want to get into sort of vilifying the British or writers, historians, but for many years, it was a very anti-Catholic discourse. So you'll see terms like the Popish, those kinds of things like that. Of course, there's a rivalry between the Catholic Southern Europe and Protestant Northern Europe, which is only going to intensify, obviously, with the Reformation. So you have a historiography where Las Casas is part of that, and Spanish Catholicism in general is painted into that. And so that's a hard thing to overcome. But what you are seeing is increasingly these people like Las Casas and some of these other figures are being brought forward, and I think a more textured and nuanced, and I think a more helpful way, especially for us who are Catholics, so that we can not have a triumphalistic view, but a more realistic view of the richness of our own tradition, and that we have our virtuous types and our villainous types. We have our heroes, and we have our, not so good guys. We can own that. I mean, I think we're all big enough to do that.
Does it seem to you, Father, that Las Casas represents actually kind of all of those things in one, in some respects? Because I mean, he himself had this transformation, right? I mean, he was a slaveholder himself, or his family wasn't he? And came to some kind of realization that was not right. Maybe you could say a little bit about that and this, like, I believe this Encomienda System that existed, that his family was a part of.
Well, I think systemic injustice is not something that sort of crops up. It's gone away. We still we're living in a time now where there's tremendous questioning about the treatment of people of color in this country, and there are systemic racial problems. Catholic Conference of Bishops have already made a clear statement on this, and we can sit with that within our own tradition. But at least for Las Casas to go back into his time, and he's part of a system, an economic, social, and a quasi-ecclesial system called the Encomienda System that was set up and based on a mixture of things of sort of coming out of medieval Spain, and then also part of the reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula, the Spanish reconquest of the Muslim-controlled parts of the Iberian Peninsula, at least in this case, what Castile, or what we call Spain today. But some of those institutions that were used in the Iberian Peninsula were brought to the New World and mixed also with different kinds of other labor tribute systems that the indigenous already had. One of the things I think about the conquest is it's not just, I tell my students in class yesterday, it's not as if it was a D-Day landing and just, millions of or hundreds of thousands of Spanish troops went forward and they conquered things. There was very brutal parts of the conquest, but there was also a degree, in many cases, plugging into existing tribute labor systems and other economic systems, labor and also other kinds of tribute that were existing in the indigenous world. Now, of course, those get transformed into a quasi religious kind of organization as well, because they were required to catechize and to, in a paternalistic way, protect the indigenous, as well as to extract tribute from them. So, Las Casas had an encomienda, one of these legal systems that allowed them to extract tribute from the indigenous, either sometimes physical objects, food or gold or that kind of thing, or also labor. So, but he has a conversion. And I think that's important to think about. And the way that I frame this in my own life, that we're all in a process of conversion. If we ever sort of think that we've, at least I believe, if I ever think that I've sort of arrived and I've sort of, the fullness of conversion has happened in my life, then really it's a really kind of a self-deception, at least as I understand these things. But our conversion is ongoing. Our entrance into the life of the Christian life, our life of Christ, is an ongoing challenge for us to go through conversion. So he goes through a series of conversions, and an important conversion point in his life, as he is a priest, he renounces his encomienda. And then later on, he has another conversion, and he recognizes the profound injustice of African slavery. He becomes a very strong proponent or denunciator of African slavery, and a proponent for their equal rights as well, as he understood them in the 16th century.
Isn't it interesting, these kinds of transformations? Sometimes in modern discourse today, you'll hear people talk about someone being a hypocrite, right? Like if somebody used to say one thing and now says something else, they're denounced as being a hypocrite. And I think to myself, well, that's not being hypocritical. That's being responsive. That's changing for the good, perhaps. And it sounds like that's the case with Las Casas here. That he changed, and in a way that was very much in a Godward direction, as it were.
Well, even the gospel today was the passage from the gospel where we are reminded to take the plank out of our own eye before we pick the speck out of someone else's eye. And I think that there's a dose of humility that comes with it, and it really calls us to do that hard work of examining our actions, our attitudes, and our dispositions. And that's a very deep process of conversion we're all called to every day. And the more we enter into that, as Jesus says, the truth will set us free. I believe that's true, but the truth is very painful too, whether it's the truth about ourselves or about the society in which we live, or even about the people around us, or even about our own institutional church. Sometimes we got to confront the truth of that. It can be liberating, but it also can be very painful for us to look at these things.
Indeed. How, as a Dominican yourself, how did Las Casas' formation as a Dominican play into the way that he was thinking about these issues, the way that he evangelized, the way that he advocated even? Is there something special about his identity as a Dominican that informed his life with regard to these issues we're talking about?
I think, first of all, he entered as a priest. He had been ordained already as a priest. He was ordained a deacon in Seville and ordained as a priest in Rome. And then he goes back, and this is after he's had his conversion and he's gotten rid of his encomienda, and he wants to try a series of reform plans where there can be peaceful evangelization and a peaceful coexistence and constructive coexistence between the indigenous peoples, but they're rapidly dying, both in the islands. They're dying of primarily European diseases, and so because there wasn't even a sense of modern pathologies about diseases, people just didn't have a sense of that. So they're dying off. He's not really thinking in those terms, although he recognizes they're dying off, but he's thinking they're dying off in the case of overwork, and they were in many cases dying of overwork or enslavement or other kinds of terrible abuses. But so he has a conversion. He enters the Dominicans after one of his failed attempts at trying to create one of these idealized communities. He has a very idealized view. In many cases, he's viewed as utopic in his thinking. There's a lot of utopic thinking at this time in the 16th century, this encounter, because you have both, as it unfolds in the 16th century, you have both the rise of Protestantism, this rupture in the church. You also have other social and political and economic problems in Europe that gesture to a sense that there's something corrupt about the old world. We can create this new kind of Christianity in a new world, and the indigenous, for many people, there's a lot of thinkers that are doing this, not just Las Casas, but they're thinking, well, gosh, we can create this new kind of Christianity that'll replace this old and corrupt Christianity in Europe. So Las Casas enters the Dominicans after one of these failed attempts at one of these trial communities, if you will, and he doesn't ever gives up on this sense of peaceful evangelization and cooperative coexistence and peaceful coexistence to avoid the abuses of military and violent conquest, not just by Spaniards, but frequently by Spaniards that are allied with one indigenous group against other indigenous groups. If we think in terms of the conquest, whether it's in the Caribbean or the various Caribbean islands, there are lots of them, on the mainland and the various different places in the mainland, very frequently is in a civil war in which the Spanish, in this case Castilians primarily, side with one group over the other, and they play different groups off the other. If we think in terms of that, it's a little more accurate of the conquest. Again, there's not, millions or hundreds of thousands of Spanish troops that come ashore that sort of invade and take over. It's just was not possible for lots of reasons. But anyway, so Las Casas has this sense of this conversion. He enters the Dominicans, and he's formed in the kind of a reformed version of the Dominican charism of the 16th century. There's a lot of reform movements for some of your listeners who are thinking in terms of Teresa of Avila at this time, and John of the Cross. There are lots of reform movements, as well as among the Dominicans and the Franciscans, trying to reform religious life, not only in Europe, but also what's going to happen in the New World. And in many cases, those religious that are coming over, whether they're Dominicans, these other groups, are concerned about contaminating the supposedly pure indigenous with these corrupt Europeans, corrupt faith-wise and morals and all these other kinds of things. So Las Casas is influenced by these reform movements within the Dominican order and the cluster of Dominicans that were formed in the school at Salamanca. And Las Casas was trained in Salamanca and also Valladolid. And then he also was trained by the Dominicans on the island of Hispaniola, which today is divided between the Dominican Republic and Haiti, in Santo Domingo, where he did his novitiate, if you will, and he did additional studies there. And he was an ongoing student for his entire life, especially dialoguing with Dominicans in very interesting and sophisticated ways. Just maybe I'll wrap up one of the things just to connect with his Dominican formation, which I think is significant, is that he was invited to study with the cream of the Dominicans, which would have studied in Valladolid, Spain, which is a beautiful city, by the way. There are lots of beautiful cities in Spain. And he would have been at the Colegio of San Gregorio, which was like a specialized think tank where just the best and the best went. And he was invited to study there before he had his debate, particularly before he had his big debate with Sepulveda, which was about debating the level of the humanity of the indigenous. One of the things that I want to just sort of get out here, and then I'll pause, you may have additional questions, is that sometimes people say, well, they didn't think the Indians had souls. That is absolutely false, ridiculous. That's nonsense. Please, we don't want people to think that way. What some did argue, and I think we can do this today too, okay, they'll find they're human, they've got a rational soul, but they're not quite as rational as we are. And one of the ways that I frame this with my students is, and especially because we increasingly have more women students at the university than men, we're over half women students here, is that women are barely had to vote for 100 years. But what are some of the arguments against women having the right to vote? Okay, they're human, they're rational, but they're not quite as rational as men, right? So it's the same kind of argument. So if you think about the logic that flows from that, is if somehow I argue you're somehow less rational than I am, then I need to help you. I need to paternalistically kind of tell you what to do or school you or control you. So I hope that gets it. But so he's formed in that sort of way of thinking. And it's not as if all the Dominicans are on the same page. And frequently some Dominicans are very much in favor of subordinating indigenous people. well as others are very much just sort of in the Las Casian camp, or Las Casas is part of some of these other groups that are thinking very differently.
That's very interesting. I want to dig into this debate that he had with Sepulveda a little bit more, and maybe you can set that up for us. But en route to that, Las Casas spent a lot more time in a lot of different parts of Latin America, I understand, and was a bishop as well in Chiapas, I think, in Mexico, right? And then eventually made his way back to Spain, and then later in his life had this debate with Sepulveda. Maybe you could set that up for us and just sort of take us up to that point and like what are the arguments, like what's happening in this debate?
Okay, well, first thing, it's not Chiapas. It wasn't Chiapas in the modern sense that the state of Mexico was called Chiapas. It was a region that included parts of what's today southern Mexico and parts of Guatemala. And was a highly indigenous zone of Mexico. It still is today. In many of these indigenous languages, these different Mayan languages are still widely spoken there. But Las Casas, your questions about setting up for this debate. Las Casas had been made a bishop. But he had a lot of experience in what we call today Latin America, parts of Latin America. In this case, he'd been in the Caribbean, he'd been in what today is Mexico, Guatemala, and other parts of Central America, as well as in northern, South America. So I divide South America, the Caribbean, Central America, North America. Mexico's part of North America. So but he doesn't go, say, for example, to Argentina, or he doesn't go to Chile or Uruguay or Paraguay or something. He doesn't get to Brazil, even though his ideas he doesn't get to Peru, but his ideas sort of precede him or follow him to these places. But with respect to the debate with Sepulveda, we're going back again to Valladolid, Spain, and I'm not getting a promotional spot from Valladolid, even though I know the Dominicans quite well there, and it's really quite an interesting city to see, and there are lots of other ones that are interesting to see. But Salamanca is very much connected with Las Casas, and he died in Madrid, Spain, but there's a plaque on the church where he died. It's a reconstructed church because it was destroyed during the Spanish Civil War. And we don't know where his remains are, but we do know he died in the convento of the Atocha. It's near the big train station in Madrid. But anyway, so in 1550-51, they're set up for this debate between he and this Juan Ginés de Sepulveda, who is a humanist thinker, very much in favor of sort of a kind of a sword and a torch, kind of a preemptive kind of war sort of mentality, if you will. Las Casas is vehemently opposed to that for a lot of reasons. One is because Las Casas has been in the Americas, Sepulveda has not. Las Casas is a clergyman, because he'd been a priest, Diocesan priest, he becomes a Dominican friar, he becomes a bishop. So he's thinking in terms of evangelizing, not with violence, but peaceful and persuasive means. Sepulveda is not a clergy person. He's not a clergyman. He's a humanist. He's very bright. He's an Aristotelian scholar. So the debate's going to center around the level of humanity. And it's a lot more complicated than I am going to simplistically sort of reduce it down to, but it's really around the basic level of humanity. For Sepulveda, it's a little bit of the argument they're human, but they're not quite as human, so they need to be subjugated militarily at first, if necessary, and then they need to be put to sort of profitable use and united to the empire instead of a Christian, kind of a militant Christian view of Christianity. Las Casas rejects that completely and says, no, they're fully human. They meet all the categories of Aristotelian arguments for civilized society. He will argue vehemently using Aristotle, just as Sepulveda uses Aristotelian arguments for subjugation. Las Casas is using Aristotelian arguments for liberation, the liberation of these people, or even just to maintain their freedom. So not the sword and the torch evangelization, but peaceful and persuasive evangelization is Las Casas' approach. And I think that fits in very beautifully if we think about our view of Christianity. Do we want to be viewed as Christians who are, believe in violence to bring about the gospel? Personally, I think that's just a very dangerous, bad, and very mistaken road to go down to. So I'm with Las Casas. But there are some people, I think, who are more, maybe have a little harsher view about Christianity. It needs to be more aggressive, more violent, not just maybe physical violence, but kind of verbally or emotional violence. I don't think that's where we want to do. I think that's the Laskasian view. But I've been so influenced by his thinking and other thinkers as well. Again, Las Casas is not in a vacuum. He's not sort of the sole light on the horizon that sort of shines out there. I think that would be simplistic and it would be putting too much pressure on just one person. But he is an important figure, and I think perhaps that's why Bishop Barron chose him. And I think wisely so. He's helping to bring him to the forefront so we can consider his life in a different context.
He definitely does seem to meet this criteria of being a pivotal player. One of these people who, as you pointed out, Las Casas's debate opponent, as it were, hadn't even been to the place that Las Casas was talking about, and so he had his foot in both camps, as it were, and he was able to kind of be this pivotal figure in this pivotal moment, even though he was certainly not the only one in Europe making the kinds of arguments that he was making. But it does seem to me, as we talk about this and as we look forward, even to where we are now in the church, that it's not just that Las Casas's perspective has won you over, but it also seems to be really what the church teaches. It seems to have a deep resonance down through these centuries in the church's social teaching, Catholic social teaching, a non-coercive evangelism, respecting the dignity of every human being. These things that many of us anyway, take for granted in the church, were not always things to take for granted, but they were true. They're true now, and they were true in Las Casas's day. So do you see that connection, sort of down through the centuries now to where we are?
I think so, and I'll go back to something you talked about, conversion. And I mean, I'm always in an ongoing conversion because I'm trying to do my own self-examination, prayer, and in dialogue with other people. And I do my best to listen to even the people that I profoundly disagree with. I do my best, but evangelization, or this sharing of what we believe is the gospel message, and we hold it very profoundly close to us, those of us who are practicing Christian Catholics, is that, but one of the challenges, I think it's a perennial challenge for all of us. I think it was a challenge in Las Casas' time. You can have two people that consider themselves devout Catholic Christians, right? But they're in very different views. And how do you square that? I'm not sure that's an easy thing to square, but it's not always easy to reconcile those things because people's convictions of their conscience needs to be respected. But I think deep within our Catholic moral tradition, and it would fit into the Catholic social teaching, is that we are called to follow our conscience. That's the most sacred part we have in in human person. But we're also called to form our conscience. And I've really deeply committed to the second part of what I'm going to say for lots of reasons, and deeply because it's rooted in the tradition. I have no right to try to force your conscience or another person's conscience. If that other person has a different view, I don't have a right to try to violently, sort of, not physically, of course, we don't, hopefully going to do that kind of thing, but whether it's through microaggressions or sort of belittling other people's ideas, I have an obligation, I think, to respect another person's views. Now, we may disagree, and if we can have a thoughtful and an honest exchange where we listen to each other, I think that's mature, and I think that's the Christian approach. Just because someone might disagree, that we shouldn't debase our own humanity by debasing theirs. Otherwise we become, we disfigure that or we besmirch, I guess maybe is a better word, the dignity we have because we're fearful of somebody else's different opinion. And I think, again, in our time right now, there's just so much acrimony, and there's not really listening. There's a lot of advocacy and a lot of sort of angry rhetoric. And I think, to go back to, I think, what Las Casas, among others, Las Casas is trained as a good Aristotelian, among other philosophical traditions, as well as the theological tradition of Thomas Aquinas of his time. it's about seeking the truth. And the truth, whether we should never feel that we are sort of, if you will, merchants of it or possessors of it. It's a very dynamic kind of thing, and it ultimately resides in God. So we can't reduce truth down to something we think it is. It's something we enter into and we dialogue with, and it's ultimately resides in God. And I think Las Casas got that because toward not long, I don't know if it was right before or right after his debate with Sepulveda, he there's a famous quote that he is, just a beautiful quote. He says, I have studied and examined the law. Las Casas was firmly first trained as a jurist. And he's thinking in terms of the law, he's thinking of human, natural, divine, and eternal law. So he's very Aristotelian in that thinking. I've studied the law for, I think he says, 52 years. And if I'm not mistaken, I think I've reached the headwaters. And this is someone who spent 50 years really after his conversion. It's like 50 years after his conversion. And I think that's nice. I like that. And I think that's hopefully all of us too. We get to a stage in our life that there's a certain maturing, and we're getting closer to what it means to understand not just law sort of in a positive human sense, and even natural law, or even divine law, but a sense that we enter into providence, which is divine law itself. We begin to understand the original life of God, and that divine law is what we're all going to be called to before in the beatific vision, where sort of the fullness of God's justice resides. And justice is about right relationship. That was talking about sort of Catholic social teaching. It's about justice. It's about right relationship with God and with our neighbor. And if you think about it, it makes sense, right? It's the twofold command: love of God and love of neighbor. We owe God our complete worship and our complete self-love of our neighbor. And I don't know about you, Andrew. I don't know about your listeners, but it's really hard work to love everybody.
No doubt about it. That's
maybe you've got it all figured out. Maybe your listeners got it figured out. Please tell me how to do it, because I am not there yet.
Definitely not. I think we all have a ways to go there. I wonder if we could transition to maybe kind of broaden things just a little bit, because Las Casas is living at this transitional time. He's this pivotal player, and the era that opens up is an era of evangelization to some degree, and we're living now with deep faith that's deeply rooted in these places where he and many other people like him went during this time. We have maybe a particular variety of Catholicism or Christianity that has flourished in Latin America and South America, and indeed in North America, where you and I are sitting. So I wonder if you could just speak a little bit about that, and maybe the legacy of Las Casas on just what the church has become, and what the mission of the church is, in our world today. Like what are kind of some of the realities in the church here in this hemisphere?
Wow, that's a really great question. And so I just finished editing an Oxford volume on Latin American Christianity. And it was it was a 9-year project, working with a whole host of scholars. It was a very rich and very powerful experience to not only edit these volumes and work with all these different scholars working in different facets of Latin American Christianity, and primarily Catholicism, because Catholicism is still the heavyweight in the hemisphere, if you will, particularly in Mexico South and also in the Caribbean. Although there are lots of parts of Latin America that are increasingly becoming non-Catholic Christian, primarily Pentecostal, and then also growing is what we have here in the United States, as well as the nuns, people who declare no religion. But Catholicism in Latin America is still about 70% on average. There's some countries it's like in the 50% centile. But a country like Paraguay is in the 90 percentile. So it's a much more, it's a stronger Catholic culture there. And other places like a Uruguay, which is maybe 50% Catholic, and there are historic reasons in their country, their neighboring countries, right? So one of the things we could do is we could sort of homogenize instead of essentialize and sort of cluster them all together. Those Latins, they're all alike and that kind of thing, I suppose people do that, but it's not very helpful. And it's also kind of trivializing. So we don't want to do that. But one of the things we can say is that pivotal moment with Las Casas and those others coming in the wake of Columbus's encounter with the New World. And I'll say it that way too, is because Columbus went to his deathbed, and I'm not anti-Columbus, so I don't want anyone to feel ruffled if they're a member of the Knights of Columbus. My first assignment as a priest, I went to all the Knights of Columbus meetings and hang out, ate and drank with the Knights. I loved it. It was great. And we've got a Knights chapter on campus for students. But Columbus went to his deathbed, and by the way, this will be sort of bring us back to Valladolid. Again, you're going to sound like I'm doing promotional spot on Valladolid, but I'm not. But not far from the convent where Las Casas stayed and also debated Sepulveda is where a house where Columbus died in the early 16th century. And he went to his deathbed still thinking he was in the Indies, the East Indies. So it leaves us the question, did Columbus really discover America? He did. He runs into something, but he still thinks he's in the Indies. But this is a pivotal moment because on the wake of Columbus's arrival, along with the conquest and colonization, the other abuses of imperial systems, comes Christianization. And in my own experience as a Catholic priest, I'm very privileged and I feel very humbled as a Dominican to be able to travel to every Latin American country that speaks Spanish and also Portuguese. Brazil is the only Portuguese-speaking country in Latin America. And then I've been to all the other countries, and I've seen this sort of, at least I've taken a sample. It's called a sampling. There's no way you could see it all, right? That would be a little presumptuous. Only you can see all things. The little samples that I've had in all these countries, and some of the countries I've been to many, many times. Mexico at least 30 times. Argentina 6 times. Some of these other countries multiple times. Well, almost all of them multiple times. But to see the variety, the range, and the complexity of, at least from our standpoint as Catholics, the diversity of our Catholic tradition. And my mentor, the late Father Edward Cleary, also a Dominican who encouraged me to come to Providence College, he used to speak of mini Catholicisms, kind of in a small c in a sense. There's the one big C that we all sort of plug into, and we have a sense of the contours of our belief system and our dogma and those kinds of things, and magisterium, etc. But within practice, there's so much variety. I think if anything has really made my priesthood much richer and much fuller is being able to see this range of practice and the interpretation of Catholicism in these different places. And some of it would seem very, very strange or foreign to probably a lot of your listeners or those who are watching this. But there would be certain common elements that you would understand that it's really part of the tradition. And that's what I try to show my students, to give them a sampling of this, because, and you can find that here in this country too, if you look for it. For example, here I am in Rhode Island, but I help off campus in a big Spanish-speaking parish, the 2 big Spanish masses every weekend. Maybe 800 people in 2 masses each mass. Oh boy, did I lose the Skype call?
Nope, you're still here.
I can pull the screen back. Yeah, sorry about that.
No worries.
I can edit that out. It's one of the good Catholic friends I call from the West Coast. Okay. I go there. The first time I went to this parish a number of years ago, as a party mass, I wanted to do a little formal poll, and there were 9 different countries, Spanish-speaking countries, plus Puerto Rico. So that's 10 different cultural groups. And the way I frame this with my students is I say, think of how many different English-speaking countries there are in the world. And I have them name them off, right? And it depends on the class where they're from, but what they've also studied. Usually start with England or Canada, Australia, New Zealand. But they forget that the largest English-speaking country in the world is, Andrew?
Well, I only know because you told me the other day. It's India.
Okay. But then you also have Nigeria.
Sure.
Of course, they speak other languages there too. But I mean, a lot of English speakers in those two countries, many, many times more than there are here in the United States. So, uh, you know, but what I'm saying is that those are all different. They're all speaking English, but they're not all the same culture.
Mm.
So if we do take that template and put that onto Latin America, and then you also take that sort of mindset or that sort of theoretical construct, you apply it to Catholicism, you realize you get this really rich sort of speaking of the tradition, and it's very, very invigorating to me. Whether it's the style of music, the way in which they worship, the way the priest presides, the kind of clothing they wear, um, the kinds of celebrations before, during, and after, the types of processions, the type of theological worldview they might have. There's all these different kinds of things that get approached into it. Kind of who's more in charge of the community when the priest is not around, whether it's lay people, sometimes it's more women, who are more involved in the ministry day to day when the priest is not there to administer sacraments. The recent Amazon summit really brought this to forefront. I had a conversation with a number of the Parati who were there, and also I was getting regular feedback from people who were actually there. And also, one of them was a prominent bishop who's worked in the Amazon region. That they, when the priests aren't around, it's lay led, and it's primarily women that are leading these communities. So those are things that wouldn't kind of fit into a North America, particularly United States, sort of understanding of Catholicism. We have a very parochial, and I don't necessarily mean that in a pejorative way, but we have a very much a parish sort of vision where we go and Father's there, and the donuts after mass sometimes, or whatever, however it might look for people, but there would be a very different model. And I've seen some of that in a lot of these places.
It does seem interesting and exciting. I know the history is complicated, but it seems to me a real sign of hope that all these centuries later, where these evangelism efforts, which were bound up even in questions of what does it mean to be a human being, what is owed one's fellow, with these basic questions of human dignity and stuff like that, that then nonetheless the Lord just gives the growth in this incredible way, and here we are all these centuries later, living with vibrant expressions of the faith in these lands that Las Casas and others during those times came across to be part of.
Good summary. You're a good listener. You know how to summarize things, pull things together beautifully.
Well, I'm enjoying learning all of these things about your expertise as well. Maybe just in closing here, what would you say to us today is Las Casas' legacy? What are the things you just really, in addition to all the stuff we've explored so far in the conversation here, what do you really want people to know about him? Why is he really important to the church in the 21st century?
Well, I started first. He's very human, and there is a process to canonize him. But he's a very human, but he's somebody who went through a profound, process of conversion, and there was a deep hunger to grow and mature and transform, and I hope that speaks to us today. At least it does for me in my own walk as a human being, a fallible human being like everybody else. Is that conversion's an ongoing process, and it's never finished. I guess we want to know that. Las Casas, I think, models that beautifully. I think he was an ongoing student of life and a student of, books and dialogue, and very vigorously so, and a really prolific writer. I mean, there are 14 volumes of his work, and I would be sort of, misleading your listeners or even you if somehow I said, "Oh, I understand his corpus completely." That would be nonsense. And I've done a lot of work on him for 27 years, and I continue to work on him, and I will continue to work on him. But I don't think just as many subject matters, whatever they might be, whatever people who are listening or watching might think that they have spent a lot of time on. You're always, if you're really humble about it, you realize you have a lot more to learn. And one of the things, without going to be too self-revelatory, is that there are a number of things that I do during the week where I'm student, where I've got to go and someone else has got to correct me. And I do that for a lot of reasons. One is I'm curious about the subject matter. And then two, it reminds me not to always be teacher or priest or professor, right? I have to be student. I have to be open to correction. So back to Las Casas, I think he's hunger for learning. He's very human, hunger for learning, I think lastly, I think maybe I might say that, I think maybe it's connected to the first thing. I think we can identify with someone who is not quote unquote perfect. And I think sometimes, at least for me growing up, I grew up in a fairly traditional Catholic family, Portuguese home, Portuguese Catholic family, very Fatima, rosary devotionally kind of thing, a lot of statues and things like that. That sometimes we make our religious figures, historical figures into these perfect people. The only downside of that is, okay, maybe they're saints now. They're sort of in the fullness of the divine life and they're before God, but we forget that they're very human. And I identify more with the human side of it's like that struggle with earth. And then you see these flaws. I think that's the mercy of God. And maybe because I'm hungering for mercy, so I also want to see it in other people. And compassion. And there's a balance between compassion and mercy, and also, personal growth and, spiritual growth and challenging the injustices. So I guess those are some things that I might throw out about Las Casas. There are probably some other things I can think of, but, he's been a very inspirational to me. Lots of other people inspire us, not just one particular person, but a lot of people, other people have inspired me. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here today. I think of my parents, my godparents, those people that really gave birth to me physically and also spiritually and continue to nurture me through life, along with many other people. Even this experience as well. Hopefully this is mutually nurturing for each other. That's what the community is about. We're not on a journey by ourselves. We're on this together. So is that helpful?
It's great stuff. This certainly has been enriching and nourishing for me, and I know it will be for everyone who's tuned in to watch this. On that note, we'll wrap up here. I'm grateful to everyone for tuning in today, and grateful to Father David Orique of Providence College, who has been my guest today as part of this Summit on Catholic Social Teaching. I'd encourage everyone to explore the rest of our resources at Word on Fire, and more to come on these important questions. Father Orique, thank you so much for spending some time with us today.
Thank you very much. God bless you.
Thank you.